I'm Althea Lazaro. I'm the librarian for English at Seattle Central. And today I want to talk a little bit about citational segregation or inclusion and exclusion in the scholarly literature. What we have found through a number of social processes, who becomes a scholar, who is able to publish scholarly literature, and who gets cited, shared, kind of picked up in the scholarly conversation, um, has in part to do with the identities of the scholars doing that research and the kinds of viewpoints that they're presenting in the literature. That there is an exclusion of certain experiences, viewpoints, and identities in the scholarly literature. And talking through how this happens is the first step in adjusting for that in your own research. And adjusting for that, I think, is important for two reasons. One, it is unjust that there has been that level of exclusion in scholarly research, but it also makes for poorer research. You'll see that the most rigorous research includes and represents a diversity of viewpoints and experiences. That's how you get to kind of the best, most rigorous answers. And that's what we're shooting for in our research. So I'm going to talk through some of the scholarship that's been done on this subject to help prepare you to think about your own research strategies in relation to this. So according to the National Center for Education Statistics, full-time faculty in the fall of 2021 had these kind of demographic representations. 73% of faculty were white, 35% white female, 38% white male. 12% of faculty were Asian, specifically 5% Asian female and 7% Asian male. 6% of faculty were Black, specifically 4% Black female and 3% Black male. 6% of faculty were Hispanic, 3% each Hispanic female and Hispanic male. 1% were of two or more races. Less than 1/2 of 1% were American Indian, American Native, Alaska Native, and less than 1/2 of 1% were Pacific Islander. If you compare these demographics to the population rates of the United States, these are not the same. These are not specifically white scholars and male scholars are overrepresented in faculty of higher education compared to the population at large and the incoming class of new students. When you look at the socioeconomic status of faculty, the difference between faculty demographics and the general population is even more stark. Combining national level data on education, income, and university rankings with a 2017-2020 survey of 7,204 US-based tenure-track faculty across 8 disciplines in STEM, social science, and the humanities. This is, by the way, this is from the article that I've got linked here to Nature, and I'll include these slides with the lecture so that you can look at this research if you'd like to. We show that faculty are up to 25 times more likely to have a parent with a PhD. Our results suggest that the professoriate, that's who makes up the professors, is and has remained accessible disproportionately to the socioeconomically privileged. That means wealthier people, which is likely to deeply shape their scholarship and their reproduction. There is an article called Communication So White that studied bibliometric analysis, that is, who is cited in the bibliographies of articles in the field of communication. And in 2018, they found that non-white scholars continue to be underrepresented, so showing up less than they do, showing up less in the bibliographies of other scholars than they are represented in the general population. They're underrepresented in publication rates, how much they're publishing in the scholarly literature, citation rates, how much other people are citing them, and editorial positions. What that means is the people who select articles to be included in scholarly journals. Those are generally, volunteer position isn't exactly right, but those are unpaid positions that professors do as part of their service to their field. So it's counted toward tenure and promotion in the field of like being a professor or a researcher. But they're the first people who look at article submissions to scholarly journal articles to decide whether they should be sent out for peer review, where the articles are reviewed by other people in the same field, and then included in the journal itself. So that's what gets called a gatekeeping role. There are fewer non-white scholars compared to the general population in those positions that edit scholarly journals and therefore select the literature that goes in there. In an article called Study Examines Diversity in Research Publishing on an article that we're going to read about in just a second, they say that bibliometric studies in communications and the natural sciences showed that white and Asian male authors, quote, exert an outsized influence on the selection of research topics, what gets studied in the first place, publish on the broadest range of issues, and are more often listed as first authors. What that means is often scholarly journal articles are written by a number of people, like a team of writers. If your name is listed first, generally that means that you were most responsible for that study. And when you go up to get a permanent job in a university, they count how many first author articles you have. So it helps you kind of stay in the profession. This article also says that Black, Latino, and women authors are underrepresented in many STEM fields and often appear as authors only in less cited fields. That means like not the kind of blockbuster fields like lung cancer research, but maybe in kind of less cited fields like cervical cancer research, if that makes sense. In an article called Intersectional Inequalities in Science from 2022, the authors found intersectional inequalities. They say that our results show that minoritized authors, that means authors who are less represented in that field, tend to publish in scientific disciplines and on research topics that reflect their gendered and racialized social identities. The compound effect of different citation rates of topics and unequal distribution on topics by race and gender leads to negative effects for marginalized groups and for science itself, as some topics become systematically less studied. The history of science is ripe with examples of understudied topics, such as female genitalia, which had direct implications on the life expectancy of women. So what this means is that this is kind of a big finding here. This says that people from minoritized identities, and we know what the minority identities are in the professoriate, folks who don't come from wealthy backgrounds, women, non-white scholars. This article says that they tend to publish in scientific disciplines and on research topics that are related to their identities. So female researchers are more likely to publish about issues that affect women, for instance. And the example given here is like female genitalia. It tends to be researched more by female scholars. But what this article is saying is that because there is marginalization, people are pushed away from the center of research. In this process, there are negative effects for marginalized groups and for science itself, because some topics related to those identities become systematically less studied. So for instance, we were looking at that article earlier that said that people who come from less wealthy backgrounds are less likely to become researchers. And since people tend to publish on the things that affect them, that means that issues that affect working class people don't get written about as much, don't get published as much in scholarly literature, because scholars from those backgrounds don't get into the fields that publish on them. There is also a phenomenon called the diversity innovation paradox. And this is from an article from 2020. This says that higher rates of novelty across several notions of demographic diversity. So what that means is when research teams are more diverse, demographically diverse by age, race, gender, ability status, socioeconomic status, those research teams tend to come up with more novel or newer research results, which is very important, especially in the field of science. But the adoption of novel conceptual linkages, otherwise known as innovation, by other scholars depends on which demographic group introduces the novelty, which means that if a group of white scholars introduced a novel concept, it's more likely to get picked up by other scholars than if the same concept were introduced by a more racially diverse group of scholars. This article also says that traditionally underrepresented groups, in particular women and non-white scholars, find their novel contributions or innovative contributions receive less uptake, are less likely to get picked up and cited by other scholars. While novelty and impactful novelty both correspond with successful scientific careers, so that's just saying that if you come up with new and novel research, you're more likely to do well professionally. They offer less return to the careers of gender and racial minorities than their majority counterparts. It would do better for the careers of, let's say, white male scholars than it would do for the careers of Black female scholars. Research also finds that the author citation network generated from our data, this is a quotation from the article Communication So White again, fits a very well-known pattern of what we might refer to as citational segregation, a preference for citing authors who are members of the same group. Now, I think that there's nothing in this research that says that this is intentional exclusion, but there is a pattern identified that you're more likely to cite research that's written by people who are more like you, resulting from established patterns of racialized professional socialization. When you're in school, you also tend to read authors that are from the dominant groups in the professoriate that we've been looking at. This author goes on to say, we often cite work we already know. Thus, one important way to counter citational disparities is to expand the range of scholarship with which we critically engage. So here's the key. So I've given you all this bad news about the kind of racial and gender and socioeconomic disparities that occur in scholarly research. But what this article is saying is that there's also a pattern of citing research that we're familiar with. So if we familiarize ourselves with research that doesn't adhere to this pattern of exclusion, if we diversify what we are reading and learning from, we are more likely to cite that later on in our careers, which kind of reverses these effects that we're talking about. So I want to introduce two important terms here, which is positionality and tokenism. Positionality refers to where someone kind of sits in their own context. So if I go, so let me think of an example. A Chinese scholar in the United States would be considered a minoritized scholar because there are fewer Chinese scholars in the United States than there are American scholars. A Chinese scholar in China is part of the majority because of that context. So positionality refers to your social identities, again, like ability, gender, race, socioeconomic status, in relation to one's context. So when you get into a predominantly white and male environment, then being non-white or female makes you position as a minority in that kind of context or situation. And that also means that, getting back to that novelty innovation paradox, that you're more likely to be introducing novel concepts into a context in which you are a minority. Tokenism is an important word to know as we're thinking about reversing these trends, because tokenism means identifying one person who you see as a part of a minoritized group and asking them or putting them in the position to represent the whole of that group. Like if somebody were like, Althea, you're disabled. What's the disabled perspective on representation in scholarly literature? To which I would reply, yes, I am disabled and I do have certain knowledge based on that social identity, but that doesn't mean I can represent other people's experiences of that. You can't use me as a token example of a disabled scholar. And this is important because as you're doing your research, you don't want to just be looking at the demographics of the scholars that you're reading. You want to be looking at the perspectives and the research that they're presenting in their literature. You won't include someone solely because of their social identity. You just want to know that as you're looking at research, you want to be looking intentionally for scholars who are introducing concepts related to those excluded social identities, like wealth and socioeconomic status and gender and sexuality and disability and race. So there's a couple of strategies that we have for fighting marginalization and citational segregation. I'm going to link to a library guide that we have in the library for finding sources that represent marginalized viewpoints in scholarship, including a lot of journals that were created about this problem back in the 1970s. Things like journals on gender and sexuality, where you can search for your keyword. Let's say you're looking at something like accessibility of school buildings. You could search for that in a journal of gender and sexuality, and you would get a feminist perspective on accessibility in school buildings, just because of where you're searching in those journals that are meant to include those identities that are otherwise excluded, or include those perspectives that are otherwise excluded. It can also be good to use different keywords for searching. So if I am searching on accessibility of school buildings, maybe I want to include the word race or racial in my search. That'll help me think about, how does race intersect with ability when it comes to the accessibility of school? And then it's also important to pay attention to when the research was published, because different words are used to represent those social identities at different periods of time. And so you might find that words that you're like not super familiar with, like for instance, in relation to disability, the term handicapped used to be used a lot more often. If I'm looking at literature from the 1980s, I might actually want to use that search term, even though it's not a preferred term and it can be kind of an offensive term now. But that's the language that was used, kind of back in time in the scholarship. So it's just good to pay attention to that kind of language. Databases and journals that are focused on marginalized perspectives, well, that's what I was talking about in terms of searching in those journals that were made about social identities, like back in the 70s and 80s. It's also good to think about seeking community sources. So because it's so hard for people from, say, working class backgrounds to get into academia, it can be good to look at what's being published formally and informally by people from those communities. So if you're researching like environmental pollution in particular communities, the people who live there will be talking about it. Finding sources from their perspectives can be a really important way of diversifying your perspective. And then try connected papers. So that thing about people citing people who are like them, you can use that also to your advantage, because if you're already looking at a source that is researching from a marginalized perspective, if you look in their bibliography at who they are citing and if you look at the people who cite them, you're more likely to find more from that perspective, which is otherwise harder to find. So I hope these are some useful strategies for you as you're thinking through how to get more diverse perspectives and viewpoints in your research. Please feel free to contact the library if you have questions and want to think about this more.